Hello, and welcome to the Feeling Good podcast, where you can learn powerful techniques to change the way you feel. I am your host, Rhonda Borowski, and joining me here in the Murrieta studio is Dr. David Burns. Dr. David Burns is a pioneer in the development of cognitive behavioral therapy and the creator of the new teen therapy. He is the author of Feeling Good, which has sold over 5 million copies in the United States and has been translated into over 30 languages. David is currently an emeritus adjunct professor of clinical psychiatry at Stanford University School of Medicine.
Have we done our hello, Rhonda?
No, we haven't. Hello, David. And hello, everyone, to episode 188. This is the beginning of a series of the Cognitive Distortion Starter Kit. And today's episode is the introduction to the Cognitive Distortion Starter Kit. David, do you want to say anything?
No, let's just dive right in.
This
is the
okay.
overview, and then we'll get into the distortions one by one.
Nice. Hi, David.
Hello, Rhonda. How are you?
Good, I'm good. It's really hot here. I don't know when it'll be hot when we publish this podcast, but it's really hot today.
Yeah, absolutely. And we were going to read some of the fabulous feedback we've gotten from your live broadcast. We don't know if this is going to be way in the future, but let's go ahead and read some of these because they were so fantastic. We've been doing a lot of live therapy in the Feeling Good podcasts, and that's been just really wonderful. We've gotten great feedback, and we're going to do more of it. People have said that those are the best podcasts of all, the greatest learning and the greatest inspiration. And a number of weeks ago, I can't say how many because we don't know quite when we're going to publish the series of podcasts we're recording starting today. But you, Rhonda, did two wonderful podcasts on your performance anxiety. And I know that involves risk, being open to a fairly large audience. You're a mental health professional, a psychologist, and yet you talked about your own insecurities, and you never know, part of the social anxiety and performance anxiety is the fear I'm not good enough, people will judge me, and we got just an outpouring of fabulous feedback for you, Rhonda, and I'm going to ask you to read one of them. We probably have 10 or 15 similar testimonials, but Fabrice told us just to read one of them.
Okay. And just to remind people, these were podcasts 142 and 143, if it's a long time in the future and you want to listen to them again. So I'm so flattered by all of the kind comments that people sent to us. So we're just going to read one, which is an example of the many that we got. And this is from someone, Christine, who said, "Hi Rhonda, I so wish I had sent this note when you first started hosting because this is what I thought from the beginning. I love the way you host. I enjoy your cheerful manner, your confidence, and I immediately thought, Rhonda is on the ball. I was surprised that you had any concerns about your abilities, but as David predicted, your openness has endeared you to me and to others. As a therapist, I sometimes ruminate over my errors, perceived or real. It's nice to know I'm in wonderful company. Thank you for your good work. I love the personal work, and I find the podcast most helpful in my private practice." I feel like I'm kind of blushing as I'm reading that out loud because it's so flattering and nice.
Yeah.
I really appreciate it.
People were over the top, and the odd thing is a lot of us feel like we're not good enough inside. And I know I felt that way a lot in my life and felt like I have to impress people or to get them to like me. And I know a lot of you who are listening to this podcast, whether you're a general citizen or a mental health professional, this belief that somehow we're not good enough and we have this real self that we have to hide from others is very common, and people will judge, thinking people will judge us as not being good enough and won't love us, won't like us, and then the huge surprise. And of course there's exceptions to every rule, but the huge surprise is that when you open up and show who you really are, instead of getting condemnation and rejection, what we've seen most of the time is a huge outpouring of love and acceptance from folks. And so it meant a lot to me to do those 2 podcasts for you. What were they like for you, and what was the impact?
You know, it's really interesting because when you first asked me if I would do do that personal work on the podcast, and you said, you know, what will we like to do the work in front of 80,000 people? But between we're in your office, it's you and me. I don't have an understanding that other people are listening. I mean, I can just forget that because you and I are working, and I'm just staying focused in the moment. And so the impact on me was, I wanted as almost an elimination of the anxiety that I felt about being a podcast host, or my perfectionism, or needing to be perfect, or being unwilling to make mistakes. So now I just feel much more relaxed and happy and accepted and kind of energized.
Thinking back, what would you say was the most helpful element in those 2 podcasts, or what were the methods? Can you put your finger on why they were so helpful to you?
I really liked the interpersonal downward arrow.
Oh yeah.
Where we talked about our relationship.
Right.
And you shared with me what your experience was, because it took me out of, myself and my own thoughts. And I thought, oh yeah, I'm not in this alone. I'm in this inner relationship with you. And that you had thoughts and feelings that were just as important as mine. That was important. And I liked the externalization of voices was really fun because, it's fun to, it's impactful to defeat the negative thoughts, but the way we did it was with a lot of joy and laughter and fun.
Yeah, that's the thing about it, is once you attack those negative thoughts, your despair turns into laughter and enlightenment. It's really a profound thing that happens.
Right, and I think that was possible because there was a lot of empathy between us. I felt really understood and cared for by you during the empathy phase, so that I felt relaxed enough to continue going.
Yeah.
I think if I didn't feel there was empathy between us, or from you toward me, I would have felt too defensive and lacking of trust to go through that process.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the empathy is absolutely critical. It's not going to cure people of much of anything, but without great empathy and trust, you can't be using these powerful techniques. And that really brings us to this series of podcasts that we're starting today, which I'm calling the Cognitive Distortion Starter Kit. And I don't know if it's a good idea or not, but it's been occurring to me that a lot of people are asking for help, and how do I know what techniques to use? In my new book, Feeling Great, I've listed over 100 techniques to help people crush the negative thoughts, the distorted thoughts that cause our misery. And it's great to have all these techniques, but it's kind of pretty overwhelming too. And so I thought, wouldn't it be neat if we could just have a series of podcasts, one on each of the 10 distortions, and then highlight what are the best techniques for each distortion. And so we're going to start that.
And I think that's really important, because after you've gone through the daily mood log and you've done the positive reframe and with the thoughts and feelings that a person has from the daily mood log, very often the first technique that therapists use is identifying the distortions. So if we could really understand what each distortion was about, that would help go through that method.
That's right, and that's so basic. There's even a column on the daily mood log, and I'll post one with the show notes for today's podcast, so people can know what a daily mood log is. But essentially, it's just a really nice form to help you organize your thinking, and you focus on one specific moment when you're upset, and then you circle all the feelings that you were having. Maybe you were sad 80% and anxious 90% and ashamed 100%, or feeling worthless or inadequate, whatever, hopeless, angry, frustrated. And then you write down the negative thoughts, like I'm a loser, I'm no good, I shouldn't have screwed up, whatever you're telling yourself. And then the next column, you identify the distortions in that thought. And then once you know what the distortions are, that this can guide you in the selection of techniques. Like some techniques are really great for all or nothing thinking, some are great for overgeneralization, some are great for discounting the positive, mental filtering, jumping to conclusions, should statements, self-blame, emotional reasoning, and so on and so forth. And so we're going to try to highlight that for you in these podcasts. Now, there's a few basics, and the first thing I want to just go back to the time of Epictetus 2,000 years ago and just review the basics of cognitive therapy, because even most cognitive therapists don't really get it. To be honest with you, it's just so basic. But Epictetus said it 2,000 years ago that the events of this world will have no impact on you, positive or negative. Positive events won't make you happy. Negative events won't make you unhappy. It's only your thoughts can upset you. It's the messages you're giving yourself at every moment, including right now, like listening to this podcast. If you're thinking, "Oh gosh, this Burns sounds like an ass," and you're probably right.
But I'm thinking of an example, like we're in the time of the year where people are graduating from high school and college. And someone could be graduating from high school or college or whatever it is and thinking, oh, I did a terrible job. I don't deserve this degree. This is a horrible experience. Why am I going through this graduation ceremony? I don't deserve it. And they might be miserable.
Yeah.
When someone else would be thinking, oh, I'm so excited. I'm through with high school. I'm through with college. I can finally start my life. I put in a lot of work. I deserve this. I earned this.
Yeah.
And so the same experience of graduating from an educational institution could cause happiness or sadness.
Absolutely. And even listening to the podcast now, if you're thinking, oh, Burns sounds like an ass, he's promoting himself, trying to sell something, you'll feel annoyed. Or if you're thinking, oh boy, this could be very exciting, this could be helpful to me, you'll feel happy and
Right.
optimistic. Or if you're thinking, oh, this sounds too hard for me, I'll never understand this, nothing can help me, then you'll be feeling hopeless. And so 20 different people could be listening to the exact same words and have 20 different emotional reactions. And I don't know how far we should go on this, but I just thought of something really cool. At my hospital in Philadelphia, we had an African American Buddhist social worker working in our hospital, and his name was George Collette. He sadly died years ago at a young age of cancer.
Oh, that's too bad.
Yeah, it was sad, but he was really a neat guy. And he created a series of 25 cognitive therapy games for our hospital for people with schizophrenia.
Wow.
And really, so we had a locked unit for people who were fulminantly hallucinating. But the hospital director said everyone at our hospital is going to be, it's a feeling good hospital, everyone's going to get cognitive therapy. So George created these games, and so that even people who are hallucinating could grasp what cognitive therapy is. And one of them he called the pepper shaker game. And he would bring the patients from this locked unit into the group therapy room and say, now I've hid a pepper shaker here somewhere in the room, and what I want you to do is get up and see if you can find it. Now it's in plain sight somewhere. Now don't let on when you see it, but when you see it, you can go back and sit down at the table, but don't tell anyone. But just notice how you're feeling and what you're thinking when you're looking for this pepper shaker. And so everyone's, goes around and they're looking, and then, it's sitting on top of the exit sign, above the door or something like that. And then finally everyone is seated at the table, and then just say, now, what were you feeling and what were you thinking when you were looking for this pepper shaker? So people said, oh, I felt angry. So he would put emotion anger. Then what was your thought? And they'd say, oh, Mr. Collette is trying to fool us. Yeah, there is no pepper shaker. They're trying to make fun of us with this game. And then put that in the thought column.
Wow.
And then others said, well, I felt really inadequate and anxious. What were you telling yourself? I was telling myself I'll probably be the last one to find it. And everyone else here is smarter than I am, and they're all gonna judge me. And then what are some other feelings you had? And then some would say, oh, I felt really happy. And what were you thinking? Well, I found the pepper shaker, and then I was telling myself, hey, I'm okay. I'm worthwhile, and the type of thing. And so here you see, everyone's having all these feelings that are fluctuating constantly depending on the messages that you give yourself. And this is a really profound idea that can transform the way you think and feel.
But I bet that could work within any group. You don't have to be schizophrenic.
Yeah, we should do that in the Tuesday group.
We should do that in the Tuesday group.
People would love that.
Yeah.
That's right. And then the second idea really came along in the 20th century because philosophers and Shakespeare, various people have latched onto this idea that only your thoughts, your interpretation of an event can cause your feelings. And then Beck and Albert Ellis and others said the second thing is that when you're depressed and anxious or angry, most of the time you'll be giving yourself messages that aren't even true, that are fraudulent. That depression is the world's oldest con. That you're fooling yourself. Your thoughts do not map onto reality. And that is really radical and revolutionary. And then I created this list of 10 distortions for my book, Feeling Good, and with brief descriptions, all or nothing thinking. You're looking at the world in black and white terms. For
You're the
example.
person that identified these 10 cognitive distortions?
Yes. Now, Beck had about 5 distortions, and Albert Ellis had one big one. Albert Ellis and Karen Horney were really the ones who popularized should statements, where you beat up on yourself or others with shoulds and musts and ought tos. I shouldn't have screwed up, or you've got no right to feel that way. You shouldn't think that. You shouldn't feel that way. You shouldn't have said that. Where you blame others or you blame yourself with shoulds. Beck had things with really big names that were hard to understand, like instead of all or nothing thing, he called it dichotomous something or other, with real big words that no one could understand.
Right.
And so I took a lot of his and just gave him simple names like all or nothing thinking and overgeneralization and mental filtering.
Yeah, and the names that you have kind of define what they are, so it's easy to remember what they are.
Yeah, and then I added a number of them as well and refined them, like emotional reasoning, and there's 3 or 4 different kinds of should statements that we'll talk about and stuff like that.
That's so cool. I didn't know that. Kind of gives me chills to think that you created all of these.
Yes, in fact, it gives me irritation because a lot of people just... A very famous colleague took my list and put it in her book on cognitive therapy and put her copyright at the bottom.
Oh, no.
Yeah, just plagiarism.
Oh, that's terrible.
Yeah, it's I
That's
guess
infuriating.
Yeah, it is. It is. It's. I guess plagiarism is flattery in a way, but it's very irritating. And one thing I loved about Albert Ellis, he didn't steal from other people. He always credited historically where he got many of his ideas. But at any rate, that's a radical idea that you're fooling yourself when you're depressed, when you're thinking you're no good.
Right, because the depression is so powerful sometimes it feels really real.
Oh,
it feels
yeah.
very real.
Yeah, you feel like you've seen the truth about yourself. You feel like you really are a loser. You really are no good. And then, of course, the last idea, which is totally mind-blowing and has transformed the history of psychiatry and psychotherapy, when it came out in the 50s due to Albert Ellis, in the 60s due to Aaron Beck, and then I was very proud to have a role in the development, creation of cognitive therapy too, with my book Feeling Good, which helped to put it on the map. But that you can change the way you feel, and you don't need to be on the psychoanalyst couch for days and years free associating, and in most cases you don't need to be taking antidepressant pills or other medications that I've never been against medications, but it's really cool that most people can recover quickly by changing these distorted thoughts, and that's what this series of podcasts is going to be about, and just give you a feel for some of the techniques.
But can you also say when negative thoughts are healthy versus when they're unhealthy?
Yeah, that's crucial. Some negative feelings are good to have. Like I was working with a young man just the other day who has, to his own thinking, severe social anxiety. I don't see it as being too severe, actually, and the prognosis is just fantastic. But he was saying that he had trouble feeling things, and kind of picked up this message growing up that men aren't supposed to, have emotions. I had that experience too. I think I might have mentioned on a podcast.
You have.
And he had the same thing, and then suddenly, he noticed he was feeling very sad at the idea of maybe this young woman that he had met might reject him. He's actually a very attractive, pretty charismatic fellow, but and he allowed himself to feel the sadness and began crying and sobbing. And he said it's the first time in many years that he's cried, but he said it actually felt great to him to get in touch with his sadness and with his tears. And when my cat Obi died, in Popcorn, I cried because I loved them so much. And if there's no distortions in your negative thoughts, then the feelings are healthy. The valid negative thoughts create healthy negative feelings. Healthy sadness isn't the same as clinical depression.
Right.
Clinical depression, you're telling yourself, I'm a loser, I'm no good. And healthy sadness, when Popcorn died, my cat, he died in my arms, I was sobbing, and
Yeah.
I was just thinking, I just love you, and you've given me so much, and you're pretty much my best friend in the whole world. And,
Yeah.
And even after he died, after they put in the injection, and he died, I just kept holding him and crying, but I didn't not want to cry. It was good to cry.
What was the negative thought you had associated with crying over your cat dying?
Just I loved him, and he was a beautiful creature, and we shared.
Those sounds like positive thoughts. I love him. He was a beautiful cat.
Yeah.
He was my best friend.
And he's gone, and I've lost him.
I've lost him.
But they're not. There's no.
I've lost him, so
distortions
that would be the negative thought. I've lost him.
Yeah.
And there's no distortion in that.
No. But in depression and anxiety and anger, you have all these distortions, like I'm a loser and I'm no good, and we'll get into all that. But the fabulous thing is when you change the way you think, you can change the way you feel. And this is a message of hope and joy, particularly for people who have been struggling with depression and anxiety disorders for years, many times, or decades without help. That this is something that you can change the way you feel. Are there other?
Can I give you another example? Because you have
Yeah.
said, and you wrote this down in the outline here, that when you're in a dangerous neighborhood and you're walking around,
Yeah.
a healthy thought, which is a healthy negative thought would be, I'm in a dangerous neighborhood, I better be safe.
Yeah.
But then
I have to be careful. So you want to feel
careful.
anxiety.
Yeah. But then maybe when you get to your house or wherever you're going, if you have the thought, I will never ever be safe, that puts you into an unhealthy negative thought.
Yeah,
Like on a
that wouldn't be a
continuum.
good example, because when you get home you'd feel relief. You wouldn't be thinking, I'll never be safe. But when people have anxiety disorders, you're always telling yourself something that isn't true.
Right.
But there's some distortions of fortune-telling and emotional reasoning, like I just know if I got on that airplane it's going to crash, and things that are not really realistic.
Well, would now be a good time to list and describe all of the cognitive distortions?
Okay, I'll put them in the show notes too. So if you listen to this, on my website, feelinggood.com, if you listen to the podcast there, you get all the show notes, and there's often a lot of work that goes into the show notes, so you get more out of it. And you've probably heard of all of these already, so we'll go through them fast. But
I think the therapists who are listening are the CBT, the team therapists are, but I think the average person, because you can rattle them off really quickly, but may not understand the differences between them.
Sure. Well, what's all or nothing thinking, Rhonda?
So that's when you look at things in absolute black and white terms, and that where there's no shades of gray, and it's completely one thing or it's completely another thing.
Yeah. Like I had a patient I wrote about in my first book, Feeling Good, was this physician was determined to lose weight, and so she ate almost nothing for 3 days. And then she was anxious, and she was thinking, oh, this is great. I'm, doing this fabulous quasi-starvation diet, and I'm going to lose all this weight. And then she was worried about some licensure tests she had to take, and so she decided to eat a teaspoon of ice cream out of her refrigerator. And it tasted really good. And then she told herself, oh my gosh, I've blown my diet completely. That would be a good example of all or nothing thinking. And that thought made her so anxious and guilty that she then went ahead and ate a whole half gallon of ice cream.
Ew.
And so
I think that's pretty common.
Absolutely. Things are either total success or total failure. Now, how about overgeneralization? What's that?
That's when you take one negative event and you view it as a never-ending pattern of defeat.
Yes, absolutely. And there's two forms of overgeneralization, really. One is exactly what you said. I got rejected by someone I love, so I'll be alone forever. That's where you take a negative event and you generalize it into all of the future. Another overgeneralization is where you generalize from a negative event to yourself. Like you think you have a bad self because you did a bad thing. Like on one of my Sunday hikes, one of the hikers was very despondent, telling himself, I'm a bad father. And what had happened, well, he and his wife had just bent over backwards doing things for their sons. Sacrifice financially to put them into a private school, taking them to the coolest places for vacations, and then the boys weren't doing their part around the house, their chores. Teenagers get kind of crabby and not wanting to do it, and then he shouted out at them, and then he told himself, well, I must be a bad father because I shouted at my sons. And the idea here was because of this thing I did that was bad or ineffective or whatever, therefore I am a bad self. And that, again, is incredibly common in depression and all of the anxiety disorders. Did you feel that with your performance anxiety?
I definitely felt it.
And what were you thinking?
I was thinking, I'll never get this right.
Yeah, exactly. And that feels so real. So you're not aware that there's these distortions. How about mental filter and discounting the positive?
So to me, those are two sides of the same coin. Mental filters when you're dwelling on the negatives, and that's all you're paying attention to, and you're ignoring all the positives, and discounting the positives when you insist that your positive qualities don't count, don't matter.
Yeah, and you were doing that again on the podcast.
I was.
You were listening. Well, you tell us.
Well, I was listening to, it was actually one of the first two podcasts that we did on social anxiety, and I was listening to them, and all I heard were the mistakes I made and the sounds I made that I thought sounded inappropriate, and the times when I laughed.
You mean when you were belching and farting uncontrollably?
Right, those. And I didn't even hear anything positive that I said. And then after we did our personal work together, I went back and re-listened to that podcast, and I didn't even hear those negative things anymore.
Yeah, it's so interesting. When you're depressed and anxious, you dwell on the negatives, and they mushroom like Mount Everest or something. Because you made, I thought, was a great comment saying that the psychiatric diagnoses like major depressive disorder, social anxiety disorder, narcissistic personality disorder, imagine that there are all these brain disorders, that's pretty nonsensical. That there's important value in categorizing different forms of suffering, but thinking that they're resulting from brain diseases or mental disorders is pretty nonsensical. And your point was great, but then you told me you got to thinking, oh my gosh, that was a stupid comment that I made. And,
Yeah, right.
And then
right.
you get super self-critical, and then jumping to conclusions that aren't warranted by the facts, where you start believing things, you just jump to a conclusion. There's mind reading and fortune telling. What are those?
Well, mind reading is when you just assume that other people are reacting negatively to you, and fortune telling is when just exactly what it sounds like, when you predict that things will turn out badly.
Yeah, and mind reading leads to conflict in relationships, either marital conflict or anger between two people, as well as social anxiety, thinking everyone's judging me and no one else is anxious, and they can see that I'm anxious, and then fortune telling is making these negative predictions. And fortune telling can lead to death. A lot of depressed patients, most believe, wrongly really, that they'll never improve. It's a tremendous mental error, but it just doesn't feel like a mental error when you're feeling hopeless. And that's why many people turn to suicide, believing that things can't change. How about magnification and minimization, Rhonda? What are those?
Magnification is when you blow things out of proportion, and minimization is when you shrink them, so you give them too little weight.
Yeah, like you see it in procrastination. You see it in panic attacks too, and anxiety, but in procrastination, because I think most of us procrastinate. I was procrastinating on some bookkeeping I have to do for the IRS, and I procrastinated for 6 months.
Yikes.
And I was just thinking, it's going to be so terrible, and I'm going to be so anxious, and I won't be able to do this anymore, and it's going to be just incredibly hard. And finally, we did a podcast on procrastination, so I said I better practice what I preach, and I broke it down into little tiny steps. And I
Right.
started doing them,
Yes.
and they were incredibly easy. And it only took about 20 minutes to complete this task. But that's
Yeah.
magnification,
Yeah.
and you just don't realize when you're doing that. What's emotional reasoning?
Emotional reasoning is when you're reasoning from your feelings, where you say, like I did this in my work, where I thought, I feel so stupid, I am stupid. You say, I feel a certain way, so that must be true.
Yeah, I had a patient who said, I felt guilty, so I must have done something wrong. And I said, well, what did you do that was so bad? And he said, well, there's this woman where I work, and she asked for the directions, to get to a certain place in Philadelphia, because Philadelphia is very hard to find your way around it. So he said, so I told her, what I thought was the best route to go there. And then he says, I'm thinking now she'll take that route, and if she ever gets killed, it'll be my fault. I shouldn't. We're not. Somebody shouldn't laugh about these things.
Oh, it's so extreme.
Yeah. But yeah, he was just feeling guilty all the time about this. I mean, he was obsessing about this for hours every day, and just beating up on himself. And he was saying, I feel guilty, therefore I must have done some bad thing, or I feel hopeless, therefore I will never get better. How about, what are should statements?
Well, I think this is a really interesting topic. So should statements are when you use the word, should or shouldn't or must, or you have to do something. And to me, a should statement is wrong because it's a commandment that something has to happen, and it's directed at yourself, and it causes you to feel guilty or depressed or inadequate when it doesn't. When whatever you're saying should, that you're commanding yourself to do or not do, doesn't happen.
Yeah, this fellow offered to sell me some rare Chinese banknotes about 30 years ago, and I was a little short on money, and I was saying, this sounds like a good deal, and should I do it? And I thought, oh gosh, I got to be more careful, so I passed on it. And they would have cost like about $40 each, and they were like super rarities. I knew it at the time, and I was telling myself, I just know the Chinese people are going to get into collecting. And I could have, I would have bought about like maybe 600 of them for about $3,000 or some tiny amount per note. And now those notes are worth about $5,000 a piece.
Wow.
And, I would have made millions.
Yeah.
So then you can beat up on yourself. I should have bought those notes.
Yeah, I think we all have examples of something
Yeah,
I
right.
should have done or I shouldn't have done.
Right. And then you can do shoulds to other people. You shouldn't have done whatever you did, and now you're ruining our relationship, and it's all your fault.
Yeah, those are a big cause of conflict in relationships, should statements.
Yeah, and the shoulds directed against yourself often go with self-blame, which is another distortion, and the shoulds directed toward other people often go along with other blame. And tell us about self-blame and other blame.
So, self-blame or other blame?
Yeah.
So you just kind of described it. Self-blame is when you're 100% blaming yourself for something that you weren't 100% or entirely responsible for. And other blame is when you blame other people and you overlook or you ignore or you choose not to pay attention to ways that you've contributed to whatever the problem is.
The most intense I ever saw of self-blame was a woman in her hospital in Philadelphia who was admitted for depression. And she had a grown daughter who was also depressed because she was undergoing a divorce with her husband. But the woman who was in our inpatient unit had learned that there's some feeling that depression may have a genetic component. And so she was telling herself, therefore my daughter's depression is my fault because it's genetic, and I never should have had a daughter.
Oh, ouch.
And it was so severe that she was sobbing pretty much nonstop.
Wow.
On an ongoing basis, just beating up on herself and saying her daughter's depression was her fault. And then another time where you see horrible self-blame is if you have a patient or a loved one or a friend who has committed suicide.
Yes.
And then you tell yourself, I should have known he or she was suicidal. I should have intervened. I shouldn't have said that angry thing that I said. And self-blame leads to depression, to anxiety, to guilt, to shame. And then other blame leads to hostility, warfare.
Contempt.
Huh?
Contempt.
Contempt, violence.
Yeah.
And I think it's fair to say that almost all of the world's suffering results from self-blame or other blame or a combination.
And then we didn't define labeling, so let's talk about that.
Yeah, and that's the last distortion. They're slightly out of order here because labeling is actually number 9. But what is labeling?
Labeling is, instead of saying, gee, I made a mistake, or I wish I had done something differently, you give yourself a negative title. I'm trying to describe this without using labeling in the definition, but you label yourself something instead of
I'm a loser.
seeing
I'm a screw up.
all the subtleties in it.
Yeah, instead of I screwed up in this or that or the other thing, you say I'm a screw up. I'm a loser. It's like an extreme form of overgeneralization, where you think you have a self that's an object, like a.
And you use a label to attack yourself.
And you attach a label to that thing that you think is yourself, and it's a bad thing. And we also love to label other people. He's a jerk. He's a loser. And then you get to look down on other people and feel morally superior and justify getting revenge and getting back at them. And you can also label and blame the world. This sucks. It's unfair. The bus shouldn't be late when I'm in a hurry, or some such thing. And then starting in the next podcast, I think we'll talk about how to crush these distortions one by one. But before we sign off for today, and again, I know this is review for folks, and I apologize for that, but these concepts are so basic.
Yeah, I think that's so important.
I wanted to put them out there. Now, something that people don't get is that when I've written about how to crush distorted thoughts, it's for you and your own distorted thoughts. I'm not intending for you to correct your son's distorted thoughts, or your wife's or your husband's distorted thoughts, or some friend's distorted thoughts, because that is not going to be effective.
But David, what if your friend comes over and they're telling you something, and you can immediately, you know what their negative
And
thoughts.
I'll show you why that backfires. So you be the friend.
Okay, I'm your
now,
friend.
By the way, I have to ask permission of our listeners. Can I show something? I'm going to do something stupid now that a lot of people would do.
Okay.
And I'm going to show you why it's no good to point out someone else's distortions.
Okay, so you're my friend, and I'm going to tell you that, my husband just called me, and he wants to buy a couch, and we don't need a couch, and it's a really dumb couch, and it doesn't fit the size of and he's very impulsive.
Yeah.
And I just think, what should I do? I mean, he is...
Well, it sounds like you're frustrated and annoyed with your husband, Michael. And I want to point out to you that you have a lot of distorted thoughts about him. You're involved in mind reading and blame and all or nothing thinking. And so your anger is caused by you and not your husband. And it is caused by the fact that you're wrong.
That is very irritating.
Do you see what I mean?
Yes, that was really irritating. I'm not kidding.
Yeah. So we're going to teach you how to change your own distorted thoughts. When you're interacting with someone else who's upset, empathy is the way to go. And we did a recent podcast, a beautiful one with Jill Levitt on that.
Okay, so David, this might be a good time to end this. I think it's a good introduction. And can you tell us about your upcoming workshops?
Go to my website, feelinggood.com, the workshop page, and you'll find upcoming workshops. I've got 3 awesome one-day ones with Jill, too. We have a full-day one on advanced empathy techniques. We've got one on eliminating therapeutic resistance.
Oh, nice.
And also we're going to do one on the topic of these podcasts, which is the Cognitive Distortion Starter Kit.
Okay, well, thank you so much, David.
Thank you, Rhonda.
And thank you to our listeners. See you next time. This has been another episode of the Feeling Good podcast. For more information, visit Dr. Burns' website at feelinggood.com, where you will find the show notes for this episode under the podcast page. You will also find archives of previous episodes and many resources for therapists and non-therapists. We welcome your comments and questions. If you want to support the show, please share the podcast with people who might benefit from it. You could also go to iTunes and leave a 5-star rating. The theme music is Gypsy Jazz in Paris, 1935, composed and performed by Brett Van Donsel. I am your host, Rhonda Borowski. We hope you enjoyed this episode. I invite you to join us next time for another episode of the Feeling Good podcast.